Hello, in this video we're going to discuss religion and its context within education. So first of all, as we go through this, there are some questions for you to consider. First of all, think about, as we talk about a lot of this is going to be background on America and its religious practices. Is America considered a Christian nation or a Protestant nation more specifically with one major religion, or is it a pluralistic nation with multiple accepted religions? So pluralistic religion or pluralistic nation would be one that has many accepted religions. Also, keeping that within context of education, what role does religion play in education? And if you say it doesn't play a role, then think further and say, well, what role does religion play in the lives of students? Which you may have a different answer on that, and how might that affect their education and educational practices? Again, keeping in mind all this different diversity that we're working through and we're looking at as we teach students. So a little bit about the different religious background in the U.S. So we'll start kind of early times is during the colonization of America. So we're looking at the first couple of colonies here. Why did we settle in America to begin with? Why did Europeans settle in America to begin with? And the answer, a lot of it is related to obviously religion. So the northern colonies, specifically that of Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, obviously, were settled by what we call pilgrims. They were also called Puritans, who were looking for a pure form of Protestantism, and that's because they were branching from the Church of England. At that time, if you do some research in history, the Church of England was kind of viewed as corrupt among some people, or it wasn't at least pure, especially with the Roman Catholic religion and the buying of salvation and it being more of a political or money thing rather than an actual religion thing. So they wanted to look at it from a pure form. So they decided we'll start fresh, move to a new country, and have our own freedom. So that's what kind of got them here. So the idea was that America was founded on religious freedom, and America was founded because of religious freedom. That's why these people came to America in the first place. So coming to America was the solution for some to break away and create their own religion. However, interesting concept here is that they weren't as accepting of others who didn't follow their own religion. So we say we were based upon religious freedom. However, the freedom was there as long as your religion aligned with what we wanted it to be. Certain Puritans, like Roger Williams, was banished because his religious viewpoints were different, and they actually led to what will eventually become the Baptist religion. But again, they weren't happy with people who didn't follow suit with their religious beliefs, even though they left because they weren't happy with the religious beliefs that they were being forced to follow. Also, aside from all of this, is we talk about Protestantism being the first religion in America and what America was founded on. However, if you look before the colonists, the European settlers, there's always the Native Americans who were obviously in America first, and they had their own form of religion and their own form of spiritual practices. And wouldn't those be considered the first religion in America? So even considering the concept of Protestantism being the first religious practices here in America is not necessarily accurate, seeing as the Native Americans here were before the colonists. So when do we start to diversify? So we had, we were based on Protestantism, if you want to consider that from the colonists. Where did all these other religions start coming in? Well, it actually comes in the form of immigration and immigrants, which we've already talked a lot about, but we'll still talk about some different waves that we had come in. So in 1619, we had our first slave ships coming in. They brought with them their own religious practices. Many of these were from Africa, so they had their own Africa tribal religious practices. Some of them had their own amongst each tribal experience. Some had unified religions there. So a lot of these dance and chants actually later made themselves into forms of religion. So some forms of religion or some denominations are very active. They use a lot of dancing and a lot of chanting, and that actually is where some of where that came from. Also, those from the Caribbean brought a type of voodoo, which has still has its root in southern coastal areas like Savannah. So in Savannah, there's actually there's kind of like a underbelly voodoo culture there that is still there, and it came over from the slaves from the Caribbean. So as we brought over these religions with the slaves. Some were resistant to allowing slaves to practice this Protestant religion that the Europeans brought over because, of course, it preached a lot of freedom and equality, and so would that mandate freedom? So were we going against our own religion by allowing them to participate in the religion. Also, your text talks about having slaves that were actually Muslims and how it made it impossible for them to practice their Muslim religion because of the structure of slavery and how they were not able to pray at certain times and that kind of thing. So they had to give up their religion altogether. Another wave that came in were New England Protestants. So the Dutch came and settled in New York. They brought Calvinism. Scandinavians came and settled in New Jersey. They brought Lutheranism. And then, of course, Jewish immigrants came and they settled in places like Charleston, Savannah, New York, and Rhode Island. So obviously Calvinism and Lutheranism can be forms of Protestantism, but they were different denominations that were kind of coming in with these different differences, subtle differences coming in. Then during the 18th century in the Middle Colonies, the Scots-Irish brought Presbyterianism. Methodism was created. It was a new religion in England, and it made its way over to America. And then also you have the Catholic religion, which was brought on not so much by the English settlers, but by other settlers, like the Spanish settlers who landed in Florida, Texas, and California. So you had the Catholic religion there, and then of course you have French settlers in the Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans, and then the South Mississippi area that were bringing over a French version of the Catholic religion. So you had that kind of going on. So you have all these waves of immigrants coming in, bringing these different religions. Interesting note, though, is that even with so many religions, in 1970, only 10% of the population had a formal religious membership. Now, some of them practiced religion, but were not formal church members. So looking at church records, only 10% of the population at that point had a formalized religion, which is kind of an interesting viewpoint. And we see that increase, and then we see that decrease again on actual membership in churches over time. So during the Great Awakening, which was during the 18th century, you saw an increase in religion, and but you saw a focus more on personal religious experience. So people, and kind of what we see today in religion, more of a personal relationship with whatever God is or whatever the being is that you're worshiping. So more of a personal experience rather than a theological or kind of these rote practices that you do that you often see in things like a Catholic religion. So the idea of personal salvation and personal choice came in versus predestination, and that the idea kind of started to change where everyone could be saved despite background, despite citizenship. Everyone had this potential to be saved and to participate in religion, which was different than the previous ideas in predestination, which was mainly upper class people were predestination, and other people who were of lower class would never participate in religion or didn't have a say because they really weren't considered religious at all. So there's a great debate in Christianity at this time. One is that God elects the chosen, which is kind of predestination. So God has already selected who is going to go to heaven and those who are and who will be religious leaders, and that usually those of the lower class, like slaves, were not chosen ones, if you will. So several groups there believed that. Then there was this idea of free will and personal relationships, which kind of won out, and kind of what we see more so in our Christian religion now, which is the idea of an individual choice. And so your choice and your actions reflect salvation. It's a personal choice that you have. And that led to a personal relationship with God rather than these rigid practices that you have, like in like Catholic religions. They're very ceremonial. This led to more of a natural personal relationship with God, or the God being that you were worshiping. And so this eventually became kind of the census in Protestant religion, and it actually kind of was supported by America because it kind of supported America ideals at the time. So we had democratic ideas that everyone makes their own choice, again looking at the American structure, the American dream, the American ideal that we've been discussing, individualism, and that kind of aligned with the religious practice, individual relationships with God. Also, this made it where all people were equal and could be saved, that everyone was a sinner and everyone had an equal opportunity, which again is kind of based upon that American ideal. So from this change kind of helped spread the idea of the Protestant religion. So the idea of free will and personal choice led to the need to expose other to religion. So if there was predestination and God already picked who was going to heaven, there really wasn't a need to spread the idea of the religion. But if people were making their own choice, they needed to know about the religion in the first place, which is kind of a common thing that we hear now in the Protestant religion, that you need to share the message or share the gospel, as we often say. And so that kind of led to a spread of Protestant religion, as those who were practicing it tried to share the idea of salvation to others. That led to traveling camps where they had events that were to convert people. And again, through this, we focused more on the mind and emotion of people rather than the theological discourse that was brought about by the Puritans. It wasn't a rote, read this, do this, that you see. It was more of a personal experience and a mindset there. Also with this caused the change of less formal training for preachers, because it was more of a calling, and we often see that now in religion, that people have a calling to religion rather than there is some formal training, but it wasn't necessarily all formal training in that regard. And we saw increases in places of worship, so increases in church building, as well as Americans actually claiming a religious affiliation. So during the Civil War, fast forwarding to the 1860s, we still had Protestants controlling most of the business, industry, and politics. But again, we have all these waves of religion starting to kind of come in. Also, Christian character ideals became embedded in the culture and in public education. So this is where you start to see um, some education pieces being put into or based upon the Christian characteristics. And again, this is based upon Protestant religion. And one of this is the McGuffey Reader, which you can see images of here. It was a common textbook that was used among the actually up until in colonial times, up and through Civil War, and it was based upon character education and Protestant religious principles. So there were like this underlying Protestant viewpoints in there, in addition to teaching actual content. So at this point, America is becoming known as a Christian nation, even though there are large numbers of Jews and Catholics. Again, Protestants are controlling business, industry, and politics. The educational system is still based upon the Protestant ideals. So now that America is considered a Christian nation, you see as more European immigration comes in, we kind of see what we were happening with religion happened to what was happening with language. So during the Civil War, between Civil War and World War One, a lot of the immigrants were Jews and Catholics, and they became much of the manual labor and workforce. So they weren't in leadership, they weren't in politics, so they didn't have really a say-so in changing of this. But a lot of it was an attempts were made to Americanize these immigrants, and so kind of turn them into this Protestant religion, kind of convert them over the same way that we were trying to convert people to English. And that was based upon the fear of being outnumbered or the threat of other religions taking over and us no longer being a Christian nation. This also happened with African Americans, especially in the southern United States. So with free slave, as slaves were freed, they still had legal discrimination, and that speaks to a lot of the racial issues that we had. But oftentimes, the churches were the only property that African Americans owned, and the preachers in those African American churches, especially AME, which is American Methodist Episcopal churches, which are primarily historically black churches, the preachers were often the most educated there. So they knew how to read, they knew how to write, and again, that was somewhat of a threat to the society, even though they were Protestant. It was a threat to kind of this European white in control background, and again, especially in the southern United States when there was still legal discrimination going on. So from here, there's kind of this accepted idea that America was based upon Protestantism. The first people that came over, the Pilgrims or the Puritans, were of the Protestant religion. So we were based upon, and we are a Christian nation. Therefore, other religions are either tolerated or not tolerated, but it was within our right because we are a quote-unquote Christian nation. That's one side of the debate. Another side of the debate is we are a nation based upon freedom of religion. So the question is, was Christianity, number one, the question is, was Christianity really even the first religion in America, considering the Native Americans who were here before the European settlers? So really, one question is, were we even really based upon a Christian religion? A second was America really founded on being a Christian nation? And so it depends on how you answer that question. Some people will say, yes, America is a Christian nation, and that's because the first settlers, who were Puritans, were of the Christian religion. Therefore, we were founded on Christianity, which is a valid reason and a valid explanation. Another was that no, America was actually founded on freedom of religion, and became a freedom of religion country, which may or may not be Christianity. And the explanation that people use for that is that Puritans came over looking for freedom of religion. They left because they were being persecuted. They wanted the ability to celebrate religion in whatever capacity they wanted to. So they came over to not be persecuted. Therefore, whatever religion they picked is not necessarily the official religion of the country, because the whole idea was that people had the freedom to pick. So obviously the government kind of took the latter response, because with the First Amendment of the Constitution kind of brought about the idea of separation of church and state, stating that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which basically meant that no religious group should have a special preference or treatment in the eyes of the government, so that there is religious freedom. However, is that necessarily a truth when, again, at this point, the majority of the people were Protestant, and Protestants were in terms of government, those were in control. So was that necessarily a truth at that point? To speak a little bit more about the separation of church and state. So at this point, there wasn't an official quote-unquote religion in the United States, because most of the country was Protestant. So questions to kind of be asked here is, what happens when Christianity isn't the most common religion? And what happens if moral values of some of these religions are very different than Christianity? Because keeping in mind that necessarily we weren't necessarily teaching the religion, we were teaching the moral values, which were based upon a religion. So what if these values did not align with everyone's religion? So that kind of led to keeping with the pace of the times. There was Enlightenment and Age of Reason, and this is where we bring in some of our, again, founding fathers, George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, and again, the idea of the separation of church and state. And so their idea was that religion molded people into moral citizens, which was basically supporting peace and social order. So they weren't maybe condoning a specific religion, but they were saying just religion in general. The practicing of a religion, the belief in a religion, is based upon moral values that support peace and social order. And so they were supportive of any individuals that use logic and reason to think or believe as one wishes, despite having what that religion is, as long as you're using logic and reason in your beliefs. This is also where the idea of avoiding government being involved in determining what students should or should not believe, and prohibiting discrimination or prejudice against other religions. And so a quote from this is, if different minds arrive at different truths, so be it, so as long as they don't disrupt social order or civil order. So, which is a great idea, except for what happens when there is a social order or a civil order being disrupted based upon a religion. So that's kind of where they were there. Interestingly, separation of church and state is based upon the choice of religion, but they used the Christian term of a church. They didn't use other religious terms of a church. So all of this is happening because America was founded on the freedom of religion, which was okay as long as the religions were similar and fit the mold of the Protestant religion, or what we thought was our ideal. But what happens when it didn't? And so this is where it starts to kind of stray, and when there's the question of having too much freedom of religion and how we reacted. So one example is Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints. That was the idea of plural marriage, and that actually came from an ancient biblical practice where men would marry multiple women. So they had this idea of that. The states did not allow for it, and it had to be abandoned in Utah so Utah could become a state. So that was where we said, sure, freedom of religion up to a certain extent, and then it didn't fit our match anymore, and so we decided to not. The next one is Blue Laws and the Holy Day. This started back in the 1610, which was called Dell's Laws in Virginia, and it required people to attend church on Sunday, and it prohibited any public practice or gaming on Sunday. So kind of the no work on Sunday, no sales on Sunday, that kind of thing. There were problems with this, however, because not all religions celebrate on Sunday. Jews observe on Friday evening till Saturday evening, and Seventh-day Adventists observe on Saturday. So there were a mismatch on not everyone celebrating on Sunday. Another thing that kind of happened was anti-war religion. So some peace-centered religions do not allow for people to engage in war. So as part of their religion, they would say, I cannot participate in war. This became a problem during military drafts. Oftentimes they were reassigned to other duties. So you could say, you know, my religious practices do not allow me to serve in war. I cannot, you know, kill or whatever because of my religion. So they would assign you to other duties. Keeping in mind, though, how does this extend to those who just don't support a war rather than it's not a religious practice? And this happened a lot during the Vietnam War when there was a huge backlash and a lot of Americans did not support the Vietnam War. And they would, you know, claim, I don't want to be in war because I don't want to be in war rather than it's a religious practice. So if we're allowing people to use religion as a way to get out of being drafted and being in the military, are we allowing other things? Also, a couple of other things were medical procedures. So some religions, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, do not believe in blood transfusions. So is it a right for the individual to be able to refuse treatment based upon their religion if it is needed to survive? And this really kind of got to be a hot topic when it involved a child. So what if a parent practices a certain religion and is therefore refusing a blood transfusion for their child, which is needed to survive? Do we allow that? Does the government step in that respect, seeing as right now we have separation of church and state? Same thing with serpent handlers, which was some religious practices where they held serpents. And so is this allowed by the government, knowing the risk that it could happen if you are bitten by a serpent that is poisonous? Is that allowed? Also, school-related activities. So, and this is where it really gets into the education side of things. Certain religions, particularly Jehovah's Witnesses, refuse to salute the flag or recite the Pledge of Allegiance because it is seen as putting something before God, which is against their religion. So originally, it was found that the social cohesion and the patriotism trumped freedom of free exercise, so they were actually made to do it. It was overturned, however, and so now, based upon a court order, that you cannot make someone do that. So those can either just stand in silence. You can't make them salute the flag. You cannot make them say the Pledge of Allegiance. So what happens if it really isn't a religion and it's just someone's opinion? Also, what if the point is that everyone can choose to participate or not? So what if it's just a matter of I don't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance, or I don't want to salute the flag because of I don't believe in X, Y, and Z, rather than an actual religious experience. So moving to a little bit more modern times, in the early 2000s, there were cases concerning the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, and no law was required finding that anyone had to say the words at all in the first place. So that statement was not removed because there wasn't a law saying that you had to even say the Pledge of Allegiance in the first place. So the question here is, does someone have this ability to make this choice based upon their religion? But isn't this a national symbol? And is there a lack of patriotism here? And should we have forced patriotism in that regard? Also, something that affects schools often related to religion are holidays. So most of the school holidays that we have follow a Protestant religion, such as Christmas, Easter. If you notice, we often have breaks during that time. So what about Jewish holidays or other holidays, things like Passover and things like that? Most of the time, students are not penalized for missing school in that regard, but how do we document when it is okay to miss school over religion? So can I just miss this week and say, oh, it's part of this religion that I practice? How do we document that? And what happens if you miss too many days because of a religion? So kind of keeping in mind how that works. And is it excused, unexcused? How do we work those? Also, use of school facilities. In the past, it used to be that gyms, auditoriums, things like that, especially places that will hold a lot of students, were used the school facilities for Protestant activities. So they would use them for different church-related events. That was actually found to be not acceptable, and so it was prohibited using school facilities in class time for a particular religion, even if it is voluntary to participate in those religions. That necessarily isn't always upheld because I know several schools that still use things like morning prayer or Bible study before after school time. Is that because it's not technically part of the school day? Is that why it is allowed in the school? Because again, there's this from 1948 prohibiting these school facilities from using class time for a particular religion. And again, this is from 1948, so it's been around for a while. So that follows to the discussion of prayer at schools in the question of, especially during graduation or before athletic events. A court case in actually 1963 decided that devotional Bible reading and prayer is unconstitutional, even if it isn't mandatory that people participate. But we still have a moment of silence that isn't for a specific religion, so maybe that is acceptable. And again, a lot of graduations still have prayers. So, and again, this was a 1963 court case. So some things are maybe there's a law against or there's a court case against, but it's not necessarily being upheld. Also, another conversation is religion as a subject area. So do we teach religion as an academic subject in terms of the history of religions, the diversity of religions? Do we teach religion as a part of history? Hey, this is the Greeks and Romans, this is what they believed. This is the Mesopotamians, this is what they believed. Do we teach different religions as we teach the history of certain cultures? Is this considered a legitimate class? And can we teach it without swaying towards a particular religion and saying, well, this is what they believe, but they're wrong. This is what these believed, and they're right. This isn't prohibited. Some schools actually do have religion as a subject area, but how do you make sure that it is completely unbiased and that the teacher that you get to teach it is not going to somehow even subconsciously sway one way or the other? Of course, a common thing that we discuss in regards to religion is that of biology in religion. The idea that creationism is viewed, the debate often between evolution and creationism. So a little background on that. Creationism is often viewed as a single religious viewpoint and is often rejected in the school curriculum. Intelligent design can be discussed as a possibility, but not as scientific fact. So that's what we have so far. In the same capacity, however, can you make a student learn about evolution if it is against their religious beliefs? And isn't there a lot of gray area for teachers? So if you were a biology teacher, knowing what you can and cannot teach based upon these different religious viewpoints, I know as myself as a teacher, I would kind of be a little bit concerned as to what I can actually teach and not teach. So how did we get here? How do we get to this point to where there's so many religions in America now, and we're having to make these decisions about what we allow in the school system and what we don't? So what brought us from being mainly one Protestant religion to pluralism or the use of multiple religions? And a couple of things brought us there. One thing was World War II, which led to soldiers being exposed to a lot of different people and a lot of different religions and a lot of different places. So also when they came home from war, often many of them relocated and didn't stay with the same denomination. So before, people would have a lifelong denomination. Now it was maybe they're of the Christian religion, but they're not of the same denomination. So during that time, a lot of people left specific denominations and became even non-denominational to where they didn't have a denomination to begin with. And that speaks to non-denominational being spread. Another thing is the education of the higher increase of college attendance and the mixing of different groups of people and movement of people, and that really spurred different ideas and different relationships and exposure to different types of faiths, so people could pick other denominations or pick other religions because they knew about them. Also, marriage often changes it. So mobility and education brought about marriages from different religions and different groups of people because you were exposed to people from different religions, and that left with the question of how do we raise the children? Do the children have a choice between both religions? Do they celebrate both, or are non-religious to begin with? So this happened with Protestants marrying Catholics, Protestants marrying Jews, people who are religious just in general versus being people who are not religious. So the intermixing of marriages caused a diversity of religion. So that leads us to now with the country having a lot of different religions. So it is debatable that we are a pluralistic country, and often that is caused from immigration. So if you look at our change in immigration laws from 1965, there was an increase in Latin America, Africa, and Asian immigrants. And so in 1970, 5% of the population was foreign born. By 2013, 13% of the population is now foreign born. So you can see an increase in the amount of foreign born citizens or people who live in the country. Interestingly, for us, from 1990 to 2000, there's been a 200% increase in North Carolina, Georgia, and Nevada in terms of foreign-born people. So, specifically in Whitfield County, there's a 50% of students, a 50% increase of students in that particular county that are Hispanic. So, and often people who are Hispanic practice Roman Catholic or they're Protestant, but maybe they have Hispanic sermons. Also, Asian cultures brought in different religions such as Hindu, Buddhism, and Muslim religions. So, an interesting statistic that was in your text is that 3/4 of all American Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus are under the age of 50, and that's an indication that many of them are in their childbearing years. By contrast, just half of the Protestants are under the age of 50. So the question is, what does that mean for our future? If a lot of the people who are of the childbearing age are of a different religion, are their children more likely to follow their home religion there? And so is America currently, and will it stay, a Protestant country, or will pluralism continue? Also, what about the 20% of people who don't even identify with a particular religion at all? So either they're atheists or they're just non-denominational or they just don't practice a religion. And then as we address pluralism and continue to address pluralism, how do we address, especially with the Muslim religion, keeping in mind a lot of the viewpoints that have come about with terrorist attacks and things like that related to a certain type of religion. Muslim practices require that people pray 5 times a day. How does that look in a regular school setting or work day? Also, how do we respond to the building of Islamic centers, especially if that particular religion part of that particular religion is to subdue non-Muslims. So it kind of goes back to the idea that some of our founding fathers had, that it's okay to celebrate any religion as long as it's not doing harm to others. What if it is doing harm to others? What if part of the goal of that religion is to subdue other religions? Is that still allowed? And then things like dress code. What about dress code of Muslim women in school and the workplace? So again, these are some things that you may experience as a teacher. Maybe you have control over it, maybe you don't, but it's questions to be considered within regards to religion.